You know, you don't come across too many figures throughout history who can say they have a whole year dedicated to them by the UN.
That's one way to leave your mark on the world.
Talk about making an impact. And in the case of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, it speaks volumes about, well, his legacy. In Turkey, but also beyond.
Oh, absolutely. It really does.
So you sent over some things from his Wikipedia page, and wow, this is a life that honestly could be a whole epic novel. But for those who might not know, who was Ataturk, and why is his name practically like inseparable from the idea of modern day Turkey?
I think the best way to understand it is that his story is one of bridging worlds.
Okay.
So you've got Turkey in a real moment of kind of grappling with its own identity between the traditions of the East and the pull of like this Western idea of modernity.
Right.
And Ataturk is the figure who guides them through this incredibly turbulent transition, and ultimately leads them to the establishment of the Republic of Turkey in 1923.
And this wasn't just a changing of the guard, right? This wasn't just like, okay, new leadership. This was a total system overhaul, their entire social and political structure.
100%, yeah. To really grasp how deeply his reforms went, you got to kind of like rewind a little bit and picture the Ottoman Empire in its final years,
Okay, yeah.
which was this vast, sprawling empire, yet rooted in centuries of tradition,
No, for sure.
with the Sultan at its head, not just as a political leader, but also as a religious leader, the
Yes.
Caliph of the Islamic world.
Right.
And Ataturk dismantles this whole system, abolishes the Sultanate, abolishes the
Oh,
Caliphate,
wow.
and really steers Turkey on this course to becoming a secular republic.
See, that's the part when you say abolishing the caliphate, and we're talking the 1920s, that's like dropping a bomb on the geopolitical landscape at the time. What on earth was the driving force, do you think, behind something that radical?
Ataturk really believed, fundamentally, that for Turkey to modernize, for it to even survive in the 20th century, it needed to make a clean break from its past.
Mm.
He saw the decline of the Ottoman Empire as a symptom of holding on to these outdated traditions, essentially.
So out with the old and in with the new. And this wasn't just about the political system, was it? It was, I mean, you said it was everything, societal, too.
Yeah, it was complete societal transformation. So we're talking, he introduces a new legal system, takes inspiration from Western models, throws out the old one,
Yeah.
completely revamps their education system from the ground up. And maybe most strikingly, replaces the Arabic script with a Latin-based Turkish alphabet.
Can you imagine
Yeah.
waking up one morning and your whole alphabet's changed? Talk about culture shock.
It's a huge part of, I think, what makes his story so interesting.
How do you even do that? I mean, was it all meticulously planned, or was there an element of just having to roll with the punches, given how big of a task this was?
That's where I think his journey, especially his military career, plays a huge role. Before he's, the father of modern Turkey, he's a decorated military strategist, a veteran of some of World War I's most brutal battles.
Yeah, and his military record isn't just impressive, it's the stuff of legend, right? Like,
Yeah.
you have to think about the Battle of Gallipoli, where he's holding off Allied forces. The odds are completely stacked against him. Talk about a trial by fire.
Gallipoli was definitely a turning point for him. It really solidifies his reputation as this strategic genius.
Sure.
But I think even more than that, it gives him this firsthand experience of the Ottoman Empire's vulnerabilities on the world stage.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine witnessing the collapse of this once mighty empire firsthand, the chaos, the internal divisions. It's not hard to see how this experience might have fueled his desire for a radically different Turkey, one that was more unified, resilient.
So, like, the trenches of World War I become his crucible, where his vision for a new Turkey is forged. It's funny how those experiences can really solidify a sense of purpose.
Totally.
But this wasn't just about, like, survival for him, though, right? He seemed to have a pretty clear idea of what this new Turkey should actually look like.
Oh, yeah. He had a vision. He
Yeah.
saw a Turkey that wasn't just independent, but also modern, secular, a major player on the world stage.
Mm.
And he knew that to achieve this, reshaping the very fabric of Turkish society was essential.
Which takes us back to those, frankly, radical reforms. We're talking about abolishing the caliphate. We're talking about changing the alphabet.
Yeah.
I kind of want to unpack some of these, starting with this whole vision he had for a secular Turkey. Like, what did that look like in practice?
Okay, so secularization was really a cornerstone of how he envisioned a modern Turkey.
Okay.
He firmly believed that separating religion and state was essential for any kind of progress to happen. And what that meant in practice was removing religious authority from all government institutions implementing a whole new constitution that was based on Western legal principles and promoting education, critical thinking, all of that over religious dogma.
Mm.
It's important to remember that even back then, Turkey wasn't this monolithic
Right.
entity.
Right.
While a lot of people embraced these reforms that he was putting forward, there was also some pretty strong opposition to it.
Yeah, I bet.
When you're talking about overturning the very foundations of a society,
Hmm.
you could ruffle some feathers.
Oh yeah, you're gonna ruffle some feathers, and some of those feathers belong to people in positions of power. We touched on the Sheikh Said rebellion
Okay,
earlier.
so the Sheikh Said rebellion in 1925,
Yeah.
this was a real test for Ataturk's government
Right.
because it wasn't just a minor thing. This was a full-on counter-revolution, largely fueled by religious leaders and Kurdish tribes who felt like their entire way of life was under attack.
Hmm.
They saw all these reforms as this betrayal of their values, their identity.
So how did Ataturk deal with something that big, that like direct of a challenge to his authority?
Well, he ended up authorizing military action
Right.
to suppress the rebellion, which he did. He succeeded.
Yeah.
But this whole event really highlights the tension that exists when you're trying to modernize a society that's so deeply rooted in tradition.
Yeah, that's a tightrope walk if I've ever heard of one. Trying to push forward with all this progress, but also you don't want to totally alienate a large chunk of the
It's a
population.
tough spot to be in, for sure.
And it wasn't just coming from outside the government, was it? There were attempts made on Ataturk's life.
There were.
Yeah.
In 1926, a former deputy who had been really vocal in his opposition to the abolishment of the caliphate, he got wrapped up in an assassination plot against Ataturk.
Wow.
And it led to all these arrests, this big crackdown on anybody that seemed like they were a threat to his reform.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, very real dangers, very real risks that he was taking in all of this.
It is a side of the story we often miss when we think about the sweeping historical stuff. It's like, oh, he changed Turkey in this way or that way. But you said former deputy, so this was opposition from inside Ataturk's own circle.
Exactly. Even some of his closest allies from the War of Independence, people who had literally fought alongside him. Even they started expressing reservations, but how quickly all these changes were happening, how
Yeah.
intensely he was pushing for them, and it caused this whole rift. This led to a new political party forming.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Progressive Republican Party.
Yeah.
And it became this platform for people who felt like maybe Ataturk was pushing a little too hard and a little too fast.
It's interesting. It adds a whole other layer when you realize he's dealing with opposition from people he was, I mean, as you said, fighting alongside with just years earlier. People who share the same vision of what an independent Turkey should be, but maybe disagree on the how and the how quickly.
Totally. And I think it speaks to that constant balancing act that he had
Yeah.
to do. He's a very strong-willed leader, somebody who was not afraid to make these bold decisions.
For sure.
But he also understood that he couldn't just force this vision of Turkey onto the nation, especially when it was still grappling with these monumental changes he was making.
You have to imagine that constant push and pull, navigating those internal and external pressures. I mean, that probably really shaped his whole approach to governing, to his whole idea of what the future of Turkey was going to look like.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's one thing to have the vision.
Right.
It's a whole other thing to actually implement it, especially when you're talking about restructuring an entire society.
Yeah.
And how he responded to all of that, I think, reveals a lot about his leadership style, about his pragmatism when it came to these really complex issues. So, for example, let's take his economic policies, specifically how he went about building a modern economy at a time when the entire world was facing this global economic turmoil.
Yeah, this is the statism thing that you mentioned earlier, right?
Right, exactly.
It always sounds a little vague to me, I have to admit. Was it more of a hands-on, centralized approach, or was he more inclined to free market principles? How would you describe that?
I think that's what's so fascinating about it, is that it doesn't fit neatly into any one box.
Oh, okay.
It wasn't about rigidly sticking to one ideology.
Mm-hmm.
He took this very pragmatic approach, kind of blending aspects of socialism and capitalism.
Interesting.
He called it statism. And basically, it was this system where, yeah, the state played a very active role in guiding and regulating the economy, but it still allowed for private enterprise.
Okay, so like a hybrid model, kind of picking and choosing from different systems. Which, I mean, that must have been its own kind of balancing act, right?
Wow.
Trying to find that sweet spot between, control and letting the free market do what it does.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think he realized that for Turkey, a country that was literally emerging from the ashes of a collapsed empire, at a time when the whole world was on the verge of a depression. They needed a different approach. They couldn't just rely on the invisible hand of the market, so to speak,
Right.
but they also couldn't afford to just nationalize every industry either.
Right, right. So how did that statism actually play out? Were there particular industries that he focused on for government control?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So he was really focused on these key industries that he thought were essential for Turkey to become self-reliant and to modernize. So that meant a huge investment in infrastructure, things like railroads, port
Yeah,
facilities.
the things that connect everybody. It's
Exactly.
the circulatory system of a country.
Exactly. All about connecting those vast Turkish lands, facilitating trade.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about building roads and bridges, obviously.
Right.
He also really prioritized things like domestic industries, textiles, agriculture, those sorts of things,
Yeah.
because he knew that for Turkey to truly stand on its own, it had to be less reliant on foreign imports. It had to create a more self-sufficient economy.
Right.
And to do that, he pushed for the creation of these state-owned enterprises. We're
Yeah.
talking about things like mining, energy, manufacturing.
He was like fast tracking Turkey through its own industrial revolution, trying to like rocket boost them into the 20th century. It's amazing. He was juggling so much at once. Like you've got these huge societal changes, you've got internal pressures, external pressures, and he's trying to create a whole new economic model for the country while the rest of the world's teetering on the edge of like full economic collapse.
And yet he's doing it.
Talk about leadership under pressure.
Seriously.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember that, not everyone was thrilled with his economic policies. Just like with his social and political reforms, there were critics.
Right. There's always critics.
Some people argued that this whole statism thing actually stifled private enterprise, that it created this economy that was way too reliant on the government to function.
So it's that classic debate, hands-on versus just letting the free market do its thing.
Exactly. And like with most complex issues, there isn't this, easy answer.
No, of course not.
Did Ataturk's brand of statism have successes? Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it did help to get industrial development moving, it created jobs, and it did make Turkey less reliant on those foreign imports.
So he was laying the groundwork for a more independent, economically stable Turkey.
Exactly. That was the goal. But it's also true that this big emphasis on, state control, it came at a cost.
Okay.
There were definitely concerns about the government having too much power, about stifling innovation by not letting the private sector compete as much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And just like with his other reforms, some people felt like he was going too fast, disrupting the old ways of doing things and leaving some folks behind, all in the name of progress.
It's a recurring theme in his story, isn't it?
For sure.
Trying to find that balance between pushing for modernization and dealing with the pushback that comes with it. It's tricky.
It is. And honestly, it's that tension that makes Ataturk's story so fascinating and still so relevant today. It makes us ask ourselves, how much change is too much,
It's the kind of thing you could talk about forever. But for the sake of our deep dive, I do want to shift gears a bit to foreign policy. How did he navigate international relations, especially with a brand new republic surrounded by some pretty powerful neighbors?
Ataturk's foreign policy was really interesting. He was shrewd, very pragmatic, and he always put Turkey's interests first, above everything else.
Makes sense.
He understood that this was a world still trying to figure itself out after World War I, dealing with all these new ideologies, and, Turkey had to tread carefully.
Right. So did he form alliances? Did he play the neutral card? Or was it more of a balancing act?
Honestly, a little of both.
Okay.
He knew that if he wanted to secure Turkey's future, he couldn't just pick a lane and stick with it. He had to play the game, so to speak.
And how?
One of his very first moves was actually to get support from, well, a pretty unlikely source, the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem like an obvious choice. I mean, Ataturk's all about secularism, a republic. That's like the opposite of what Lenin and the Bolsheviks were all about.
It does seem counterintuitive, but you have to remember the context. This was a time of shifting alliances.
Okay, yeah.
Both Turkey and the Soviet Union saw common ground on regions. They both had this enemy in the old guard, the British and the French empires, who were still trying to hold on to their power in the region.
So it was more of a like the enemy of my enemy sort of situation?
An alliance of convenience, for sure. They put aside their ideological differences to focus on that shared goal.
Wow. And Ataturk was never one to let ideology stand in the way of what he thought was best for Turkey. He took the opportunity, accepted military and financial aid from the Soviets during the Turkish War of Independence. And, it turned out to be crucial to their victory.
Absolutely crucial. But as we move into the 1930s, things are changing again.
Right, the world never sits still for long.
The threat of fascism is looming large in Europe, and Ataturk realizes he needs to adjust his strategy.
So,
He starts to distance Turkey from the Soviet Union,
okay.
and instead, he starts fostering relationships with the West.
So Britain, France,
Exactly.
always adapting. It really highlights how Ataturk's Turkey, it wasn't content to just sit on the sidelines. They wanted to be a real player on the world stage.
100%. He saw Turkey as this modern nation involved in global affairs, a bridge between the East and West, and he knew that to achieve that, he needed a foreign policy that was flexible.
Speaking of bridges, his work in normalizing relations with Greece was huge. I mean, that's no small feat given their history. How did he manage that?
That really was a testament to his statesmanship.
Yeah.
He understood that clinging to past grievances, it just wasn't productive. So he starts these direct negotiations with Greece's leaders.
Wow.
And it all leads to this Treaty of Friendship in 1930, and it really did pave the way for greater cooperation between the two nations, more trade, even population exchanges.
That's amazing. Countries that had been rivals for so long, it does make you think maybe some modern leaders could learn a thing or two from that approach.
It really does.
But even with all those diplomatic wins, Ataturk's legacy is still complicated.
Oh, definitely.
In Turkey, he's revered. He's the father of modern Turkey, the leader who brought them back from the brink.
Rightfully so.
Yeah, I mean, look at everything he achieved. But his methods, they weren't exactly, well, he wasn't exactly known for being gentle.
That's putting it lightly.
So how do you reconcile that? The fact that he was, authoritarian at times, that he suppressed dissent. How do you square that with all the good he did in modernizing Turkey?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right.
And there's no easy answer. It's at the heart of how people view his legacy, not just in Turkey, but everywhere.
He's just one of those figures you can't easily define. Revolutionary, but also a pragmatist. Championed progress, but also ruled with an iron fist when he thought it was necessary. It's a lot.
It really is. And trying to judge figures from history, especially ones as influential and as controversial as Ataturk, you really need to see the nuances.
That's a good point.
You've got to acknowledge both sides, the good and the bad, because history is rarely black and white.
This whole deep dive has really been, I don't know, eye-opening in a lot of ways. History is more than just names and dates.
Oh, for sure.
It's about ambition and ideals and compromises and sometimes, yeah, ruthlessness.
About people.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our look at Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the question that sticks with me, and maybe with you, our listeners, is this. Was he a force for good who brought Turkey into a new age, or was he an authoritarian leader who took power at the expense of individual freedoms?
It's the question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer. Ataturk's legacy, it's complicated, just like the man himself.
Absolutely.
To understand him, you have to look at everything, all his actions, the good and the bad, and really think about the impact they had.
What a journey from, literally the battlefields of World War I to the halls of power. Ataturk's story really shows the power of a vision, ambition, and the sheer difficulty of building a nation during such a tumultuous time in history. We hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of this incredibly important figure, and that it sparks some questions about leadership, about progress, about what it really means to create change. As always, thanks for listening, and keep diving deeper.